Urs, excited to be back on the Swiss View. Today, we're going to be talking about markets, what they've been doing the past couple months around the globe, where we think they're kind of heading. I'm going to get your thoughts there. We want to talk about the environment of the central banks, kind of some tensions in economies, central banks, things going on. U.S. government shutdown. I think there's a lot to kind of dive into at that section. But to start, I think it'd be really good if we could kind of talk about the conflicts around the world that are happening and how we see them kind of having a potential effect or a non-effect on the markets. I mean, if we start, we've had some conflicts going on for 2 or 3 years, major conflicts. I mean, there's conflicts all the time.
Right.
But what are we seeing in the Russian? I mean, there's been some hot bubble around the Russian-Ukraine conflict. What have you been seeing?
Yeah, we have now the 28-point plan from the U.S. government, which was discussed in Geneva recently. So there has been some back and forth, some tilting around what is feasible and what isn't. But it is interesting, especially with this conflict. A lot of the sentiment is based on what can happen. I mean, if we go back and look, just the other night, there was like huge bombing going on still. So the conflict is very hot still. But media and a lot of investors trying to focus on the positive, on what could the solution be. And so we also see, when we look into the defense industry, that the stocks which have outperformed massively over the last couple of years starting to tank. And so there is this kind of insecurity. Okay, if we have peace, then maybe defense isn't as attractive anymore. But in reality, you don't really see that peace yet.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of a similar situation when we turn and look, I would say, more to the Asian Peninsula with the Israel-Palestine conflict, where a ceasefire has been reached. But that ceasefire wasn't everything is now done and there's no one kind of fighting. There's those phases, right, of those ceasefire plans where there's still things happening, there's still things kind of bubbling that could create hotter tensions that could pop off. And all of that insecurity, whether it's the Ukraine war, the war in the Ukraine between Ukraine and Russia, in Palestine with Israel, there's always this kind of underlying feeling that is it really going to get settled? But again, people trying to look to the future, trying to be optimistic, and markets, I think especially when you talk about the defense sector of, will defense sector still be important once their conflicts, if the conflicts reach resolution? Absolutely, right? Europe has been now on a path, Germany trying to, invest in the infrastructure of their defense. So that won't necessarily go away. It just won't be active conflicts that remind us, oh yes, there needs to be spending here.
Yeah, and the question always is how much fantasy is in these prices.
Yeah.
Oftentimes when you're having a hot phase of like a specific topic with defense, but also with artificial intelligence, like there's so much money flowing in, and there is a certain point where it is not that much about value or about what are the realistic perceptions, like what the future will bring. It's more about sentiment, about like, okay, I want to be part of that, and that's why I'm chipping in too.
Yeah, and I think it's always something interesting to see where the hot button issue is, right? And how markets can kind of react. I think another conflict that we have to kind of keep our eyes on, because it also had a little bit of an ignition recently, is the China-Taiwan dispute. I mean, for China, it's not a dispute. Taiwan belongs to China. For Taiwan, it's also clear that they belong to themselves, not China. But recently, the new president of Japan said that she and Japan would back Taiwan if there was any, kind of invasion or takeover of Taiwan, which kind of caused some hot water, especially kind of right in the midst of China and the U.S. kind of reaching better deals or figuring out a way on terms of their trade war or trade conflict, I guess we could call it. And what kind of have you seen anything kind of come out of that, or effects being played at the market there?
Not that severely yet, but it reminds me to an article I read about, I think 2 years ago, when a general, I think from the Marine or whatever, stated that he expects China to make attempts in 2026 to invade Taiwan. And so it's really like, you see how the heat is slowly increasing,
Mm.
and you start wondering, okay, where does that go? Are we going to solve one conflict or kind of solve one conflict, and then there is another one popping up somewhere else? And so it's also coming at the end of the day towards like the market is priced towards perfection.
Yeah.
And there is so much like positivity in the markets if you look at where the markets stand, how they are valued. But at the same time, you see all the ongoing wars, all the ongoing geopolitical conflicts, and what could come next year. So there is a lot of risk, but will it materialize? I don't know.
Yeah, and I think one of those, I mean, a little bit more materializing than not. I mean, the China-Taiwan conflict seems to always be in the topic of conversation, despite not tons happening.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe some airspace invasion or water, you know, crossing different water barriers, I guess you could say, from military ships. But now we see kind of even with the U.S. and Venezuela potentially kicking off, you know, some activity going on there. It'll be interesting to see how the markets react there. I mean, obviously, it's where are you looking at the markets in South America? What effects does Venezuela have on that or not have on that? How the rest of the relations between the U.S. and South America kind of kick in. But I think that's kind of at the start. We're not really too sure where that's going to lead, obviously, in the next couple moments. But I think looking at the markets in general, it's been quite an interesting or sorry, not the markets. We want to talk about the central banks. So we were talking about the conflicts of that are challenging the world, but there's a lot of conflicts for central banks. The ECB, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, and the Swiss National Bank, all different situations a little bit. But I think it'd be good if we kind of give a picture into kind of what's going on. I mean, especially with all of the U.S. data not being there for the month of October, government shutdown. Also, no data is given out. What are you kind of seeing?
Yeah, I think with the U.S. Federal Reserve, it's the most obvious one where we don't have the data necessary to make a decision. So on their FOMC meeting, which will take place on December 10 and 11 or 9 and 10, we don't expect that there will be too much movement. It will more be like, okay, we are keeping observing the situation, seeing what new data will be available at one time or what time, and then make a decision.
Yeah.
With the Bank of England, it is more interesting because there we have the whole budget dispute again, once again, similar like
the U.S.
US, but also France. And their CPI is still high, so inflation is still at 3.6%. It came down a little bit from 3.8 to 3.6, but 3.6 is still high. But at the same time, you also see that the government debt in England, the gilts, that they are the yields are lowering. So there is some expectations that the Bank of England will lower interest rates, even so inflation is still high. And they kind of have to do it because they have a problem that individuals, but also companies, are not willing to invest. So they are more tilting towards saving more money because they are so insecure about what the future brings. But the government needs investments to kick off the economy again. And so there must be some kind of incentive to do so. Yeah,
and I think there's even a challenge there of they have to kind of activate that money inside of the economy. They have new taxation laws that have, obviously impacted how England's going to look over the next couple years, and we're not tax experts, so I'm not going to get into all the details. But there's been a significant flow of money outside and questions of, do we really want to invest here because of some of the changes that, we'll have to see England forge their way. I mean, France obviously is still, challenged with their issues, but we kind of see that situation in three areas, right? We see the U.S., they had their own budgetary issues of a government shutdown, overspending, not a shutdown in France or England, but still budgetary issues. So when we turn our eyes to Switzerland, we see a little bit of a different picture. While in the EU, yes, inflation is closer to its target of 2%. I think the EU roughly, or the euro area, is about 2.3, 2.4%.
No, it's even below 2% now. It's at around 1.8.
Did it come?
So that's expectation true. Also that it is lowering a little bit, and then next year it's picking up again. Yeah. And so the thing is, since the expectations are that the ECB, the European Central Bank, and the Fed are going to keep interest rates stable, it will also release some pressure from the Swiss National Bank, because the Swiss National Bank is already at 0%, as we have discussed previously oftentimes. And so for them, it is important to not being forced into negative territory.
Yeah.
Because what I mentioned before is like the markets are priced perfection. What that means, if central banks to a certain extent, they have to react if markets start to crash or to correct. And as we have seen in the past, it doesn't need so much so that happens.
Yeah, and I think especially when we look at markets being at kind of like all-time highs, not totally. We've seen over the last month, most markets have actually come down. Whether it range, around the globe, right? In Asia, in Europe, in the US, you've seen markets kind of have a pretty rough month. If we look just a month back, month to date, let's call it. Have kind of negative. The only one actually that I saw that was not either flat or down was the Swiss market index and the Swiss performance index, which are the two, Swiss indexes for our listeners who are curious. Now, that doesn't mean they're performing year to date better than everyone else, but it's interesting to see, the US and Switzerland reach their deal. And then there's just a little bit more stability there, because Switzerland's already, that was kind of the instability of Switzerland at the time. And that they had to work through and what we've been dealing with.
Yeah, and that's an important point which we haven't discussed yet at this episode yet, is that the Swiss government reached a deal with the US government about the tariffs. So it was agreed that they are going to reduce it from 39% to 15%. It hasn't happened yet, but they are working on it. And so there again, like the perception of a more positive environment moves markets.
Yeah, and I think that's a kind of leads us into a question I wanted to ask you. So we have the Swiss View, this podcast that we talk about the market, but we also have our newsletter that you author every 6 weeks. That's also called the Swiss View. It gives market analysis. In October, you were a little bit more pessimistic, I would say, in your writing. And this most recent edition, you were a little bit more optimistic. So could you kind of explain that kind of, you mentioned in the new one that there might be a year-end rally, that you could see it happening. So could you explain what kind of drew you from that pessimism to maybe a little bit more optimism?
Yeah, so the thing is, it's not that I'm neglecting the risks. I still think there are a lot of risks, which I have mentioned, and that it can turn around very quickly. But as I also said, is there are more and more positive news coming up with the peace negotiations, with the tariffs, not only with Switzerland, but also the Trump administration agreed that they are removing tariffs on certain foods like beef from Argentina and other countries. And so with this continuous flow of positive news there and there, so there is this perception where investors, they also want to have a year-end rally. And so if they in some way can justify it, they might be one. Even so, if it's not rational from a valuation perspective, I still think that the risk of a positive outcome towards the end of the year is a given one.
Yeah.
Or is there.
Is there. Yeah. And I think that's, how do I say that? Everyone wants, every year, everyone wants a Santa Claus rally. It doesn't mean that it happens, but yeah, like you said, we want to be optimistic, especially in the Western world heading into the holiday season. We don't want to head into it, obviously, with stress of what's happening at the markets, what's going on. I think also the economic data of looking at just Switzerland, right? Pretty challenging economic data for the third quarter, but they were sitting under 39% tariff.
Right.
So everything having its lagging effects before we see where things are going. Okay, 15%. Will that bring back some of that? Will there be expansion? Will it be light expansion? These are things that we're going to have to see rolling. And I think for me, what highlights also the challenge of trying to figure out what's going on and seeing the risks and challenges or potential upsides or down. When you just have, from the world's largest economy, a month's data that's not given, it's just simply not provided. It's very that is disconcerting.
Yes.
And challenging, especially when you do have inflation that was, 6 months ago, really headed back towards the target and now is back up over 0.5%. It's like 0.7% up again. And so it's like, knowing what's going to trigger and what not, I think it's good that you kind of clarify that, there's these different factors, obviously, that can cause an upside, but that there are still obviously risks that are kind of baked in to the current situation.
And that doesn't mean that you have to put, throw everything into the market and walk away. You still have to follow it very closely and be diversified in a way that you are covered, whatever the outcome will be.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Urs. Look forward to doing it the next time with you.